Continuing our mini-series about presentation skills, we're moving on to a more widespread and traditional means of disseminating information, the paper poster. In this podcast, we'll flesh out the roles, benefits, and limitations of the paper poster, review essential components, and also look at tips and tricks to make a more successful poster. The goal of a poster is to present the main strokes of a research project in a visual form, combining text and illustrations. It is a time and space efficient means of knowledge dissemination at meetings and events because any number of attendees may review any number of posters simultaneously in an area of interest. Posters are a tried and true mode of communication, and researchers and readers are familiar and comfortable with them. The only limitation on content, in principle, is the size of the paper. With great freedom, though, comes great temptation. Paper posters do allow the reader the flexibility to spend as much time as necessary to grasp the content. I'm being a bit cheeky here, but my experience with paper posters is that readers don't want to engage the presenter until after the poster's been reviewed, which can create an awkward one-way communication path. This is a true advantage. It takes a lot of tech and adequate access to wall sockets in order to run a successful e-poster session. The access to view or present posters may be limited by the number of workstations. All you need with a paper poster is a wall. I feel this advantage requires no explanation. There are some disadvantages to paper posters. First, printing can be expensive and proofreading becomes critical. If you've ever presented a poster at an away event, I don't need to explain this to you. There's also the inconvenient reality that the carry case may look like it could be used to carry other objects that will make your airport experience truly memorable. If you're fortunate, once you've paid to print your poster, you can shop it around at several events before retiring it to the hallway wall. However, some meetings have specific formatting or size requirements that may or may not be accounted for in your current poster, in which case you get to redo and pay again. Finally, posters have been abused in the same way that PowerPoint presentations have been. If done well, they are a powerful communication tool. All too often, though, they are hard to negotiate, visually intimidating, or just plain ugly. The chances of people reading your poster if it looks like it's going to take a lot of work approaches zero from the wrong side. If you recall nothing else from this podcast, remember that posters are a visual medium and will work best if you respect the principles of engaging visual media. These headings will look very familiar and are the standard ones. You're basically expanding your abstract. To avoid overload, all of your data does not have to go on the poster. Structure everything to relate to the primary question. If the reader really wants to go over all the other data, they can either ask you at the time or wait for the manuscript to come out. You also don't need to list all 35 references. Select 3 to 4 references to include. It's also important to read the instructions for the place where the poster will be presented, because some groups will want ID numbers included, disclosures, or funding. As with the ePoster podcast, this medium works best with one main question for discussion. To avoid making the reader really have to work hard, don't use jargon, abbreviations, and difficult language. Use pictures where possible and adequately explain abstract concepts that are important to the study. If you think you still have space, resist the temptation to start adding content if you've achieved your central message. As with slide presentations, you want a clear, easy-to-read font that is large enough. This is the time and place for short, punchy titles in a nice, clear, large font. Images should be high resolution and large enough to easily see. If you push on through the basics and have creative flair, you can start to play with the visual format, but please consult some of the links at the end of this podcast for more ideas and discussion on maximizing visual appeal. The next goals concern layout. This can be very challenging to achieve with posters, but if you can, remember that the eye doesn't want to sit directly in the center of the paper. You want the eye to move around. Absolute symmetry is not a good goal. These nodes are focal points for visual exploration, so make use of this. At the same time, if you use columns, they need to be the same width. Visual interest is greater if your eye has to move around, so try and keep key figures, text boxes, or tables off the direct center. However, the flow of ideas still needs to be visually intuitive. This is another one of those times where asking a colleague or friend not involved in the study of or the poster creation to provide feedback on how the flow is. Because paper posters are so visual, color choices do matter and can really assist you in making your point clear to the reader. Choice of color matters when you construct your grafts and other figures as well as background and text colors, and you should make decisions about color and font as early as when you first create your figures. Consistent and well-chosen font and color schemes will make your poster look polished and professional as well as appealing. For any of you who've taken an art class, this sort of thing will be review for you. On the left we have a color wheel. Yellow, blue, and red are what are called primary colors. You can use these three colors to create all other colors. Orange, purple, and green are complementary colors and are created by mixing two primary colors. Tertiary colors are made by mixing a primary and a complementary. On the right we have a grayscale. This represents color intensity or value. Any of the colors on the wheel can be rendered at any one of the intensities shown on the right, so you've literally got thousands of choices. One way to use color strategically is to consider selecting color palettes, in which a few colors are used either to emphasize or create an overall effect. This slide shows an example of use of only primary colors. It's a bold palette, and depending on whether you select bright or subdued primary colors, you can create considerable emphasis. This next strategy is where two main colors are a primary color of your choice and its complementary color. For the figure on the right, the primary colors are blue and yellow, while the complementaries are orange and purple. On the left, the primary is red, while the complementary is green. Striking effects can be made, and this is often very visually satisfying. If you take a wedge out of the color wheel and use those colors, it's known as an analogous palette. These are two such examples. The effects can be subtler than some of the other types of palettes, but if well constructed, can still direct the eye to the point of emphasis. Interestingly, the U of C slide templates available for use make use of an analogous palette between yellow and red. Another option is to use a monochromatic palette, where a single color is used at graded intensities to produce an effect. If you look at some of the stock chart color schemes in Microsoft Office, some of them employ this approach. It can be effective and it's not too visually busy, but you won't get as much punch as if you had an accent color. A final example of color palette selection is probably the simplest to use when beginning to think about this, and it's one that I've gotten a lot of mileage out of. Neutral colors are blacks, browns, grays, and whites. One very bright, very saturated accent color is selected and used for emphasis. In this illustration, the purple cushions fill this role. You can use any color for accent, but yellows and light greens may still not be intense enough to convey the message, so be a little bit careful here. Clutter is the absolute enemy in this project. You do not want so much text, so many figures, and so many different colors or fonts that it looks like the image on the left. Having clear space is really important visually. The U of C has a basic poster template available for PowerPoint or Keynote. It's pretty utilitarian and rigid in form, but it can help get you started in creating your own. As you can see, it's adopted a neutral with accent color palette. If you are going to use this poster, either embrace the red as your accent color when you construct your visuals, or change the color scheme, including the red, entirely. In conclusion, poster creation is an important means of disseminating research findings. It's also a medium that is guilty of failing to disseminate due to poor or ugly poster construction. Your goal in creating it is for as many people as possible to read it and remember it. To that end, careful planning, construction, and a simple message will help your posters succeed where so many have not. A lot of information has been presented in this podcast. We're going to unpack it a bit in the workshop, but for further reading and ideas, I've provided some web links that go to sites dedicated to ending the bad poster. Please check them out. In the next podcast, we get to the end of this mini-series on presentation of results. We're on to everybody's favorite, the talking slideshow.